The fence post leaned like a tired soldier, split and half-rotted from the long years of sun and rain. Elias Carr pressed his weight against it, steadying the wood while his other hand wrapped wire around the post. The sky above glowed copper with the last of daylight, and the land breathed in silence, the kind that carried both peace and loneliness. His shoulders ached from work, his beard carried dust, and his thoughts were the same as they had been for years, about the chores unfinished, the winter creeping closer, and the fact that no one waited for him inside the house. The sound of hooves came slow, not hurried like trouble, but steady, deliberate. Elias paused, hand resting on the post, and turned his head. Across the stretch of his land, 2 riders approached. The sinking sun turned them into silhouettes first, dark shapes against the horizon, but as they drew near, their faces came clear beneath the weight of shawls and braids. Something in his chest gave a jolt, not unlike a heart remembering an old wound. He knew them. 15 winters past, when snow lay heavy and game was scarce, 2 half-frozen Apache girls had stumbled to his door. He'd given them bread, wrapped them in blankets by the fire, and the next morning they had gone without a word. He never saw them again, though their eyes, hollow then, filled with hunger, had haunted him often in the silent hours. Now they rode toward him, no longer girls but women. The elder carried herself with the steadiness of someone who had buried more than she had loved. Nàshdóíí, her name rose in his memory like a half-forgotten prayer. The younger, Tala, had eyes sharp as flint, her posture wound tight as if ready for insult or fight. Elias dropped the wire slowly, wiped his palm against his trousers, and stood waiting. When they reached the fence line, neither spoke first. The horses shifted, exhaling steam into the cooling air. Finally, Nàshdóíí lifted her chin. "Your land stands where ours once did," she said, voice even, low. "We came not for charity." Tala's gaze cut sharper. "You fed us once when no one else would. We remember." The words carried no softness. They fell like stones, heavy with what was left unsaid, the years of silence, the gulf between their worlds. Elias's throat worked. He wanted to ask where they had been, why they had come back, what had become of their people. But his voice, when it came, was rough as gravel. "You're welcome here." The words sounded smaller than he meant them to, fragile against the wind. In town, whispers had already begun. A pair of Apache women riding back with Elias Carr would not pass unnoticed. Cold stares followed them when they tethered their horses near the mercantile. Men muttered under their breath, women pulled children closer. Elias felt those looks burn into him, but the sisters carried themselves like stone, neither cowering nor confronting, simply existing where no one wanted them. When they returned to the ranch, Elias lit the lamp in the kitchen. Its glow fell on the old table where he ate his meals alone. He set 3 plates without thinking, the scrape of porcelain loud in the quiet. The sisters exchanged a look that was neither distrust nor gratitude, but something in between. They ate little, movements careful, shawls draped close around them as though the room itself might turn cold. Elias watched them more than he ate. Their braids shone dark against the lamplight, their silence was filled with unspoken memory. He felt a weight he had forgotten pressing back into his bones, the weight of responsibility, of being needed. Later, when the dishes were stacked and the lamp burned low, Elias stepped out onto the porch. The night stretched wide and indifferent, stars scattered like ash across black sky. Behind him, he heard the low murmur of the sisters' voices through the wall, foreign words, soft, carrying memory. He leaned against the porch post, the same way he had leaned against the fence earlier, holding up what was about to collapse. The past had ridden back to his door. The bread he had once broken with starving girls had returned to him in the form of women who would not let him forget. He realized then that hospitality was not just the offering of food or shelter. It was the opening of one's life, the carrying of another's scars alongside one's own. And though his hands were rough, his house empty, and his name tarnished in town, destiny had circled back, demanding he face it. Elias exhaled into the night. The wind carried the sound away, but the truth remained. The silence of his life had ended, and nothing, least of all he, would ever be the same. The night stretched longer as autumn pressed its cold fingers against the ranch. The hearth, long used only for cooking, began to glow with firelight that carried a different warmth, human presence, faint but undeniable. Elias sat often in the rocker by the flames, its creak a rhythm that filled the pauses between breaths. Across from him, the sisters wove their evenings in silence, shawls wrapped close, hair drawn out in long braids that gleamed when the fire caught them. It was in those hours that fragments of their past escaped, not told in story form but in slivers, like sparks rising from the logs. Nàshdóíí spoke of the winter when snow buried their family's camp, of waking to silence where voices had been. She described carrying her mother to a shallow grave, the earth frozen hard, her hands bleeding from digging. Tala, younger then, had followed behind with bare feet, too cold to weep. When she spoke, her words came sharp, more like defiance than memory, of settlers who turned them away, of stones thrown, of how hunger ate more fiercely than wolves. Elias did not answer often, but when he did, his words were sparse, plain as unpainted wood. He spoke of his wife, Anna, whose laughter had once filled the walls of this house. He spoke of the morning she did not rise from childbed, and of the infant who never breathed. He left the cradle upstairs untouched. Dust lay thick upon its small rails, but he had never moved it, never could. His voice faltered there, and silence closed over him like a blanket too heavy to lift. The sisters listened, and though they did not reach across the space between them, something softened in their faces. They knew the shape of loss. Widowhood. Orphanhood. The language of grief was one they all understood, though none of them sought to name it. At the table, Elias no longer set one plate. Without thinking, his hand always laid three. The scrape of porcelain against wood became ritual, quiet but insistent, as though he had been waiting for years for someone to sit at that table again. The sisters ate sparingly, still cautious, but each evening the distance between them seemed to shorten by a thread. Tala sometimes let her guard down enough to hum under her breath, and once Elias caught himself leaning forward, listening to the tune as though it might unlock something long buried. Outside, the ranch felt changed. Horses stamped in the corral as if sensing the shift. Even the air in the house felt different, no longer hollow, but filled with low murmurs, with the sound of braids brushing shawls, with Elias's rocker creaking steady as a heartbeat. Yet shadows did not rest quietly. When Elias rode into town for supplies, he felt eyes like knives on his back. Two men at the livery spat in the dust as he passed. A woman at the mercantile turned her child away, whispering sharp words. One rancher muttered near the hitch rail, "Carr's lost his senses, keeping heathens under his roof." Another added, "Won't be long before someone teaches him what it costs." Elias kept his jaw tight, hands steady on the reins. He knew better than to answer rumor with rage, but the weight of it pressed heavy. He brought flour, coffee, and salt back in his saddlebags, riding home slow beneath a sky bruised with clouds. That night, the wind howled around the eaves. Inside, the sisters sat close to the fire, their voices threading together in a song not meant for him, words strange but filled with cadence and sorrow. Elias leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching. The song rose and fell like waves on distant shores, carrying memory he could not touch but could feel in his bones. It filled the room with something both foreign and familiar, like a prayer he did not know yet wanted to believe. The shadows of their pasts hung in the room, yet in those shadows something stirred, not comfort, not yet trust, but the faintest sense that none of them bore their burdens entirely alone anymore. The house, long stripped of laughter, breathed again, its silence broken not by joy but by survival, and for now, that was enough. The storm came sudden, rolling down from the mountains like a dark beast loosed from its chain. One moment the sky was heavy with silence, the next it split wide with thunder. Rain poured hard enough to rattle the shingles, and the wind drove it sideways so it beat against the windows like fists. Elias was at the hearth, feeding the fire, when he heard the crunch of hooves in the mud outside. Through the curtain of rain a rider appeared, a shadow moving against shadows. The horse stumbled through the yard, foam bright on its neck. Its rider slid down with the ease of someone born to the saddle, though his movements carried the weight of scars. He pushed the door open without knocking, and the storm seemed to follow him inside. The man was Apache, tall, lean, his face lined with both weather and bitterness. One scar dragged across his jaw, another cut deep through his brow. His eyes found Elias first, then the sisters by the fire. "Nàshdóíí. Tala." His voice was rough, but it carried recognition. Tala rose quick, defiant as a flame. Nàshdóíí stood slower, her hand brushing her sister's arm, steadying her. The man's gaze shifted back to Elias. His hand rested casually on the stock of the rifle slung over his shoulder, though there was nothing casual in the weight of it. "I am Desba," he said. "Cousin to them. Blood of their blood. And I see them living under your roof, white man." The air tightened. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the walls. Elias's own rifle leaned by the door, close enough to reach. But he did not move toward it. Instead, he studied the man with eyes that had seen their share of threats and measured what lay behind them. "You question me?" Elias asked, voice low, even. "I question your right." Desboro's words cut sharp. "Too many times your kind fed us with one hand and struck us down with the other. Why should my sisters be safer here than anywhere else? Tala stepped forward, shoulders squared. Because we chose to come, she said. Her tone was hot, edged with a dare. Nàshdóíí's voice followed, softer but firm. Desba, he gave us bread when no one else would. We would have died that winter. We do not forget. Desbara's jaw worked, but his eyes stayed locked on Elias, waiting, testing. The storm rattled the roof, water dripping through a seam by the door. Elias turned without a word, lifted the blackened coffee pot from the hearth, and poured into 3 tin cups. He set them on the table, the steam curling into the room. Then he poured a 4th, slid it across the wood toward Desba. His hands did not tremble. Sit, Elias said simply. For a long moment, Desba did not move. The storm outside howled, rain lashing harder, as if to push him one way or the other. Finally, with the faintest sneer, he stepped forward, the rifle still slung but his hand loosening its grip. He dropped into a chair, lifted the cup, and drank. No one spoke for a while. The fire popped, thunder rolled, and the coffee cooled slowly between them. When Desba finally broke the silence, his words were heavy as stones. This land has broken too many promises. Be sure you do not make one you cannot keep. He stood then, leaving the cup half empty. His eyes lingered on the sisters, something between warning and farewell, before he turned toward the door. The storm swallowed him as quickly as it had delivered him. Elias closed the door after him, leaning his palm against the wood as if feeling the storm's pulse through it. Behind him, the sisters sat quiet. Tala's jaw was tight, her defiance unspent. Nàshdóíí's shoulders sagged, as though she had carried a weight too long. Elias turned back to the fire, the shadows of the flames dancing across his face. He had not drawn his rifle, and yet the test had been as sharp as any bullet fired. He knew now that what lay ahead would not be a fight of weapons, but of endurance, of holding ground without spilling blood. The storm raged on through the night, but by dawn the clouds had broken, leaving the land washed clean. Desba was gone, but his warning lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Elias stepped out into the mud, breathing the damp air. He understood then that the real storm was not in the sky, it was in the divisions of blood and memory, and it was far from over. The days after Desbara's visit carried a different weight, as though the storm had left part of itself behind. The sisters moved through the ranch with quiet purpose, yet the air between the walls felt stretched thin, ready to snap. Elias rose each morning before sunbreak, same as always, but now there were other footsteps in the house, softer, lighter, reshaping the silence he had lived with for years. They worked alongside him, though no words bound them to it. Nàshdóíí steadied fence posts while he hammered new wire, her shawl pinned tight against the wind. Tala carried tools, her eyes always flicking to the horizon, as though expecting riders cresting the hills. In the evenings, by firelight, they cooked simple meals from the meager stores, beans, salt pork, bread baked hard as stone. Nàshdóíí mended his shirts, her fingers moving with patient skill, and laid them folded with care he had not seen since his wife. Tala, even in the safety of firelight, kept her rifle within reach, sometimes laying it across her knees as she ate, daring anyone, perhaps even Elias, to question her need for it. Elias watched them with something that was not comfort and not quite longing. Gratitude stirred in him, but alongside it ran unease. He worried that his need showed through every small gesture, the way he lingered too long at the table, the way his eyes followed their movements. He had lived so long without company that he feared he clutched too tightly at it now, like a man parched holding to his last drop of water. The town's voice grew sharper with each passing day. When Elias rode in for supplies, silence met him at the mercantile. Men stood in knots near the hitch rail, pausing their talk until he passed, then starting again with words just loud enough to cut. One morning, a rancher named Colton rode out to Carr's place uninvited. He sat his horse by the corral, boots muddy, hat low. "You'll lose your standing if you keep harboring savages," Colton said, voice carrying a thin smile. "A man's reputation don't survive that long around here." Elias met his gaze, steady as stone. "My standing was lost a long time ago." He turned back to the fence post he was working, and after a moment, Colton spat in the dirt and rode away. But the warning stayed, bitter as gall. At night, the ranch seemed almost too small to hold all the silence inside it. Elias would sit in his rocker, staring at the fire, listening to the house breathe. Some nights he heard Tala's sharp voice through the walls, hushed but urgent, as if she argued with ghosts. Other nights he caught the sound of Nàshdóíí's quiet weeping, so soft it almost broke the air. Those sounds worked on him more than Colton's words or the town stares. They reminded him of his own nights spent bent beneath grief, listening to the cradle upstairs rock with the wind as though some unseen hand touched it. The cradle had never held a living child, yet he could not part with it. It sat there still, dust thick on the rails, as if it carried proof that he had once almost belonged to something greater than himself. The sisters carried their own shadows, just as heavy, and though the fire lit their faces each night, their eyes still bore the distance of people standing on another shore. Elias knew trust was something brittle, fragile as a glass jar on a rocky trail. One wrong step, one wrong word, and it could shatter. So he kept his voice low, his movement steady, offering what little he could, a cup of coffee poured, a chair drawn closer to the fire, a fence mended before they thought to ask. Yet each night he wondered if it was enough, or if the weight pressing down on all three of them would one day splinter the fragile roof they shared. The night was still until it wasn't. Elias woke to the smell first, a sharp sting of smoke cutting through the cool autumn air. Then came the crackle, faint at first, then swelling into a roar. He was on his feet before thought caught up, pulling on boots, grabbing for the rifle by the door, though it was no use against what he already knew. The barn was aflame, fire leaping high into the black sky, painting the yard with a violent orange glow. Horses screamed within, ropes snapping like gunshots as they thrashed against their stalls. Elias ran headlong into the blaze, heat striking him like a wall. Behind him came the sisters, shawls clutched tight to their faces, eyes reflecting the wild light. "Cut them loose!" Elias shouted above the roar, though the words were half stolen by smoke. Tala's hands were quick, her knife flashing as she slashed ropes, driving the panicked animals toward the open doors. Her braid whipped behind her as she struck the flanks, yelling with fury that matched the fire itself. Nàshdóíí was at Elias's side, steady as ever, bracing his weight when he stumbled through the smoke. A beam gave way with a shriek of splitting wood, crashing down across the path. Elias pushed Nàshdóíí back, but he was too slow. The timber struck his shoulder, knocking him to the ground. Pain tore through him sharp and hot, his breath stolen. Flames clawed closer, sparks raining down. Nàshdóíí dropped without hesitation, covering him with her body, her shawl smouldering at the edges. With a strength he would never have guessed from her quiet bearing, she dragged him out from under the timber, inch by inch across the dirt, until the night air hit his lungs again. Smoke poured out of him in ragged coughs, each breath feeling like knives. Through blurred eyes, he saw Tala driving the last of the horses through the open doors, her figure half shadow, half fire. She turned back only once, to be sure he was standing, before she vanished again into the smoke to seize what little could be saved. By the time the fire burned itself down to embers, the barn was half ash, its roof caved in, its timbers blackened bones against the paling sky. The yard smelled of scorched hay and smoke, the air thick with loss. The horses huddled at the far fence, wild-eyed but alive. Elias sat on the ground, his back against a trough, one arm hanging limp from the blow. Nàshdóíí knelt beside him, her hands gentle as she wrapped a strip of her shawl around the wound, the fabric carrying the scent of fire and earth. Tala returned, soot streaking her face, hair loose, eyes still burning with the heat of battle. No one spoke for a long while. The silence between them was not the silence of suspicion or distance, it was the silence of having walked together through fire and come out alive. Elias looked at the two of them, their faces lit by the last dying flames, and something within him shifted. They had risked themselves not from obligation, not because of bread once shared, but because some bond had already taken root between them. When dawn came, pale and thin, the ruin of the barn stood stark against the light. Yet Elias did not feel only loss. His wounds ached, his land was scarred, but for the first time in years, he did not feel alone. The sisters sat with him in the cold morning, shawls drawn close, their presence steady. Nàshdóíí's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, her eyes meeting his with calm certainty. Tala leaned on the fence rail, her rifle slung loose at her side, the fight still alive in her but softened by the sight of him still breathing. Elias understood then what the fire had forged, not debt, not desperation, but choice. They had chosen to stay, just as he, though scarred and broken, would choose them. In the ashes of what was lost, something stronger had taken root. The smoke of the barn still lingered in the rafters of the house, weeks later, a faint reminder that scars did not fade quickly. Elias walked with a limp now, his shoulder bound, the ache of fire deep in his bones. The sisters had taken to the rhythm of the ranch as though they had always belonged, Tala with her sharp eyes, tending the horses that had survived, Nàshdóíí at the hearth, mending, steadying, her quiet presence a counterweight to every silence. For a time, peace seemed possible. But rumors ride faster than wagons, and the town had been feeding on them. They came in the morning, when the frost was still bright on the grass. 6 riders, dust on their coats, rifles across their saddles, their faces hard with conviction borrowed from fear. Elias saw them from the porch and felt his chest tighten. He had expected this. Fire could be blamed on accident, but whispers had made it otherwise, that strangers under his roof had brought danger, that harboring them was betrayal. He reached for his rifle, the familiar weight of it steadying his hands, though his leg trembled beneath him. When the riders drew up, their leader, a man Elias had once traded cattle with, spat in the dirt. "You've gone and lost your sense, Elias. We won't have Apache women living under a white man's roof. Send them off, or we'll see it done ourselves." The world narrowed. Elias could feel the sisters behind him, their breath close. The rifle lay across his good arm, ready, but he knew too well what blood spilled in his yard would mean. His lips parted, but before words came, another voice rose. Nàshdóíí stepped forward, her shawl drawn, her face calm as stone against the cold. She did not raise her voice, yet it carried with a weight none could ignore. "You remember," she said, eyes moving from man to man, "the winter when hunger cut through every cabin. Bread was shared then, without question. My kin gave what we had. And when we buried our dead, none spoke against it. Now you come to strip what little dignity is left. If you call yourselves men, remember what was owed, and remember silence has a cost." Her words hung in the air like the echo of church bells. Tala came to her side, fierce as fire, her braid catching the pale morning sun. She said nothing, but the set of her shoulders, the defiance in her gaze, carried its own truth. Elias stood between them and the rifles, but it was no longer he who bore the weight of defense. He felt it. These women were not guests to be guarded, they were guardians in their own right. The riders shifted, their certainty faltering. One muttered something, another lowered his eyes. The leader held on a moment longer, jaw tight, but even he could not withstand the silence pressing back at him. One by one, reins were tugged, horses turned. The sound of hooves drifted away into the hills, leaving only the brittle air and the breath of those who remained. Elias let the rifle sag. His leg ached, his arm throbbed, but for the first time in years, the silence around him was not hollow. It was full of voices that had spoken, of courage that had stood beside him. Days later, with autumn settling gold upon the grass, Elias harnessed the wagon. He did not speak of leaving them behind. Instead, he said simply, "We'll fetch what's left." The sisters knew his meaning. Their family's belongings lay buried miles away, left in haste, abandoned to the earth. Now, at last, it was time to bring them home. The road stretched long and dusted with falling leaves. Elias held the reins, his limp stiff but steady. Tala rode with her rifle across her knees, eyes scanning horizon and sky. Nàshdóíí sat near the bundles, her hands folded, a quiet song slipping from her lips. The wagon wheels creaked, the horse's breath rose in plumes, and the three figures moved together through the turning season. They were no longer bound by accident, nor by hunger, nor by desperation. They were bound because they had chosen to be. A widower with an empty cradle, two sisters with graves behind them. Together they had found something that resembled family, not by blood but by endurance, by the simple act of staying. The ride was not thunder, nor fire. It was steady, unbroken, carrying them toward a home remade from silence. And in that steadiness, love lived, not in the blaze of passion, but in the quiet strength of companionship, in the shared road that stretched on, mile after mile, beneath the turning sky.